Hi, good morning everyone. Great to see all of you. I also already see that we have active chat. We almost already 100 viewers on time. Also expecting some late joiners. So welcome everybody to today's session. So today we will talk about Workations. And we see a lot of interest in this event, but also in general in the last months. We've seen a lot of excitement about this topic, but also a lot of insecurity from employers. So, as you know, it's a huge topic nowadays in HR, in legal, in global mobility departments. So that's why we invited you today to discuss these topics. As you know, from an employee perspective, Workations or temporary work from abroad is already a mega benefit, without a question. Some companies that try to get people back to the office with free fruits, free coffee, free public transport. I don't know about you, I don't know anyone who joined a company because of a fresh fruit basket. But I know a lot of people who want flexibility in their job. And you also see the statistic here. 37% of employees would take a pay cut of up to 10% if it meant they could work remotely. So without a question, this is a mega benefit. And from the employee perspective, look, Workations looks very easy. You take your laptop, you hop on a plane and fly somewhere. And then you can work from the beach, from the skiing resort, or from some other exotic locations. But from the employer perspective, it's not that easy. It's a little bit tricky. And especially around compliance and data protection. And these are the two topics that are holding also a lot of companies back from offering this to their employees. So that's the goal of today's session. We want to educate you as employers about compliance and data protection. And that's why I have two colleagues here that I invited today. Two of the leading thought leaders in this industry. First of all, I would like to introduce to you Pieter. So Pieter, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? And also, since we're talking about Workations, where are you planning to take your next workation?
Yes, of course. So good morning, everybody. My name is Pieter Manden. I'm Dutch, working remotely from Amsterdam. So hi from Amsterdam. I see a lot of people telling us where they're from. Berlin, Ulm, Croatia. Really cool. So I'm from the Netherlands. My background is that I'm a tax lawyer. Worked at PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers for a very long time, 13 years, always in the tax consulting department around employment in the widest variety or widest sense of the word. Before I joined WorkMotion earlier this year as the head of trust and employer compliance. So I should know all about tax and legal compliance related to your employees working either permanently or temporarily from abroad. Yeah, my next vacation, quite frankly, I think every vacation we go on is hard work because we have two young kids. My wife is now trying to lure me into a vacation/workation in South Africa for December of this year. So let's see if she manages.
Nice. That's also definitely a very popular spot for Workations. Thanks, Pieter. Great to have you. And then also Jonas, tell us about yourself and where you're planning to take your next vacation.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Jonas. I practice as a lawyer based in Berlin, and I practice mostly in IT law and data privacy law, supporting different companies with their digital strategies and helping them becoming GDPR compliant. I'm also the data protection officer of WorkMotion. My next workation will probably be in Mallorca. I'm going to Mallorca at the end of June for 3 weeks, and 2 of them will be proper holiday. And the last week I'm trying to work from there. So I'm really excited to see how it will turn out for me.
Nice, sounds very exciting and also a good spot. And shortly about myself, my name is Patrick. I'm a technology expert. Basically, I love making things simple. So in my role at WorkMotion, I take the complexity of Pieter's, but also a Jonas resort and try to make it easy with software. and I do this as a general manager of WorkFlex, which is one of our products. Me myself, I will also take my next vacation in Mallorca in Spain. So Jonas, both of us will be there, and in fact is one of the most popular destinations. So we know that 17% of the people take vacations in Spain. So it's the most popular country. So you noticed Pieter and I, we both work at WorkMotion. Quickly, for those who don't know us, we are a company and we support other companies in managing employees abroad. We do this with 3 different products. With Work Global and Work Direct, we help companies to hire people abroad. So for example, if you want to hire an engineer in Spain, but you don't have an entity, we support you with Work Global and Work Direct. And then with WorkFlex, we help companies to enable and to offer workations to clients. So WorkFlex is more the product or one of the solutions to the topics that we're presenting today. In general, at WorkMotion, we are specialized in highly regulated markets. We are headquartered in Berlin, but we have a presence around Europe, but also globally. What's interesting about us, we are around 250 employees and we are fully remote. So we not only offer this as a service, but we also live it ourselves. But enough with that. We want to talk more about Workations today. So let's deep dive right into it. And basically, as an employer, you need to think about how you're going to handle this topic. And basically, you need to ask yourself 2 questions. And if you look at this matrix, on the y-axis, you see the first question that you need to ask yourself. Are you going to allow temporary work from abroad? So yes, you can either allow it, you have a policy, or you don't have a policy. And the second question that you need to ask yourself is how you're going to manage the risks. Are you going to have a system in place to manage potential compliance, but also data protection risks? And the other one is not to manage it. I'm also very interested in, because we have a very active chat, which is nice, very interested also where our audience, where the company is currently positioned. So what I will do now, I will also start a poll. So you can then say, for at least your company, where are you positioned? And before we get into, so the poll is now started. And before we get into discussion, I already see there are a lot of questions in the chat. We love it. So it's very great. I would like to have or point you towards the ask a question function. You can see it at the bottom right. And you can ask a question through this, and then other people can upvote, and it's much, much easier for us to answer. So we are not able to answer the questions from the chat, but please use the ask a question function. So having introduced this matrix, companies already only have 4 options. When in doubt, it's probably option C. But from a compliance perspective, especially from a tax compliance perspective, Pieter, what is your view on this?
Yeah, so where you like to make things simple, of course, Jonas and myself, we're lawyers, so we like to make things a little bit more complex. And you can already see it from the poll now coming in answers. You see a lot of A, which is obviously red. We like to keep things on the right-hand side, obviously. I'm quite passionate, of course, about the future of work, and I think you should definitely allow workations. If you do not allow it, people are probably still going to do it regardless. So if you do not allow it, then at least enforce this, let's say, this you forbidding this lease policy. So I would say at least make sure that you're on the right-hand side and manage the risks. We'll get to the risks later a little bit. What you see now during the pandemic, it was okay to not manage this topic, and that's where still a lot of employers are located. They're seeing what happens. They're knowing their employees are enjoying workations, maybe without even asking. And employers are probably just either struggling with or consciously awaiting where the market goes in terms of, okay, I'm going to do what the majority is doing. And you do see a slightly moving tendency, I guess, where now employers are starting to, on a standard basis, allow limited Workations, so 30 days, 2 weeks, maybe something like this. I think that's a great trend. I would urge employers to then also right away jump to the right-hand side of this quadrant and say, okay, we have a policy, we should definitely manage this on a daily basis.
Thanks for your insight on this, Peter. So this comes a lot from the data, from the tax compliance side. Jonas, what are your thoughts about this from the data protection side?
It's basically quite similar to what Peter just said. Also, in terms of data privacy, one part of the story is if you allow workation, if you allow remote work, it creates a risk. That's just part of the story. And especially in terms of data privacy and GDPR regulations, working from remote, working in workation simply increases the risk of making data accessible to people who are not authorized to having access. But the thing is, basically, the real world is full of risks. So, of course, the utopia from a hardcore GDPR people would be work only, I don't know, at the end of the world in a solitary mountain. But this is just not the real world. So we just have to face it. And I think, therefore, it's important to understand that we have to accept that there's no this such ideal, fully compliant world. And the important takeaway from this is, I think, that it's all about identifying risks and managing risks. And this is what this matrix basically say. And that's, I think we will deep dive. We have later on, we will face those topics. But the important takeaway basically is identifying and managing the risks. That's how you handle like the real world and not this utopia which doesn't exist.
Yeah, thanks a lot for these insights. Now, I also see, and I find it very interesting from the poll, the majority of people mentioned B, which is great to hear, but we have a lot of employers mentioning A and C, so there seems to be some risk. Peter and Jonas, you mentioned tax risk, you mentioned data protection risk. For our audience, could you make it a little bit more concrete? What is a potential risk that you can see? Are there any examples that you can give?
Yeah, I could start. I think a very simple, obvious risk would be in the field of legal visa immigration. One of your employees going to whatever country, probably not a European citizen, going to not within the EU, but for instance, traveling to the US, where customs are quite particular. And this individual is being interviewed and gives the wrong answers, if you will. Because he says, well, I'm here to work for maybe a month or two, and he doesn't have the right, let's say, papers in his hands, and he gets declined. And if you get declined in the US, that also means that you cannot travel to that country for the next 5 years. So although it may sound like a great plan to enjoy a workation from New York or wherever, if things go south, it has quite significant consequences for the employee. And that's just one example. I think in the field of visa and immigration, everybody can identify how that would feel for the employee.
Yeah, makes sense. And thanks for sharing this example. And we heard in the past many more examples. And it's definitely something that companies want to avoid and try to move more to the right, to the low risk or no risk side. Jonas, from the data protection side, what can happen in the quadrant A or C?
I mean, from a data protection perspective, it's all about controlling the access to data. And of course, if you do not work within your company's building, it gets harder and harder to control the access. And I mean, results can be, if you don't control that risk, that can be like getting a fine by the authorities, and those fines can be up to 20 million within the European Union, so quite high.
Yeah, these are definitely some scary numbers. So thanks for sharing these examples. And I also see, like in the chat, one other example was managed. So a risk of revenue generation. I think Dieter is referring to permanent establishment risk, which is also a topic that employers need to handle. So there are definitely a variety of topics companies need to focus on. I mean, for this, we have prepared today 3 deep dives. So first of all, we would like to understand more about tax compliance. So this will be led by Pieter. We then talk more about data protection side. And in the very end, we're going to talk about potential solutions for employers. So everybody of those who answered either A or C, how do you get yourself into the C or D quadrant? Pieter, talking about tax compliance, could you give us some more insights?
Yes, absolutely. So there's a variety of tax/legal compliance risks other than data security, obviously, related to your employees temporarily working from abroad. We've had previous webinars where we really started from scratch on, for instance, this topic of permanent establishment, but also on the topic of payroll and social security, where we really talk about the basics. So if you are basically new to this topic, then I suggest you can watch one of the previous webinars that are also available for you on the Crowdcast, because given the limited time that we have today, I will deep dive on some of the key issues that we have with various risks. So I'm definitely going to skip some steps. For instance, I'm not going to explain all of the basics around PE. So that's just for the audience to know. Anandita, beautiful name, already mentioned it in the chat. Indeed, permanent establishment is definitely a risk of your employees traveling or working from abroad for a while. Very short, what is a PE? It's creating a business presence in the destination country without you already having that presence. And it creates 2 very important consequences. And the first one is administrative burden, by far the most important one. You'll need to register. Probably you'll set up an entity if things really go sideways. You need bookkeeping, etc. You also need payroll. So it's very heavy administrative, but it's also financial, because at the core, a PE means that you have to pay corporate income taxes in that destination country, for instance, in Spain. So there's a lot of bad news around PE. It's generally considered by employers, our clients, as the biggest risk related to temporary work from abroad. Social security is important, payroll is important, but PE touches on the corporate structure, which companies are paying millions and millions euros for to structure it so carefully. So that's why this is considered very important. The good news around PE is there is no permanent in temporary work from abroad. From our perspective, if you're looking at workation, PE is something that you can very well manage. It's a high risk, but it's manageable. Why is that? You can look at the 4 bullets here. A fixed place of business PE, I'm not going to share the details, but usually only is being constituted after 6 months. And for us, 6 months is not temporary work from abroad anymore. So fixed place of business risk in the destination country, pretty low. Service PE, exactly the same. There are hardly service PEs within Europe, but of course, but if you look at other countries such as India, service PE is a very well adopted topic, but also service PE is generally not constituted as of day 1 if you're planning on only being there for a month or 2. Dependent agent PE, the third one, DAPE, that's really the problem when you're looking at temporary work from abroad, together with accumulation. That means multiple persons being in Spain, for instance, on Mallorca during the same time, working for the same company. But there, if you look at these cases individually, in our view, and especially with our software, you can manage that very well. Why? Because not everybody is a dependent agent. And even if you are a dependent agent, you can still be instructed through just simple instruction sheet or so to not perform those activities that really trigger a PE. A DAPE on itself, or a dependent agent on itself, does not trigger a PE. This individual has to perform certain activities. And that you can still manage very well, as I said, but you would have to create, of course, some kind of a process, maybe instructions. And the same goes for if you're wanting to manage the accumulation. You would have to know where your individuals are. You have to know on which projects they are working. So for permanent establishment, although it's the biggest showstopper generally what we see in practice for employers, I think it's not justified. It's totally understandable that it's a big thing, but you can manage if you manage. And on the other hand, if you're not allowing workations and you're not managing it, as we've seen from the previous overview with the quadrants, I think you're even in a worse spot, because then you will not be able to instruct your dependent agents on what to do or what not to do, and you will not be able to assess any accumulation in a destination country. So that to PE, we spend a little bit of extra time on this, but that's for a fair reason. It's by far considered the most important risk for your people working temporarily from abroad. The second one we can go through much quicker. It's payroll. Your risk of having to set up a payroll in, for instance, Spain for this individual is only working there for 2 months. Of course, that's something that you don't want. We help you manage it. The good news is PE is the key driver for payroll. In other words, if you have a PE, you'll also have to set up a payroll in 99.99% of the cases. On the other hand, if you are capable of mitigating PE, as I said, I think that's well possible. You're also in the process, more or less, mitigating your obligation to having to set up a payroll. There is an exception, and that's around the employee's center of vital interest. I'm not going to jump into the detail, but anyone who knows this term will probably agree with me that it's pretty unlikely that someone who's only going on a workation to Spain or to India or to New York is going to suddenly have his or her center of vital interest there. For that, you'll require a couple of other things like a bank account, your family there, property or so. Through the WorkFlex process, we definitely gather that information so that we can assess this exception. But let's make things clear. I think this exception of the center of vital interest is truly an exception. And we should mainly look at PE in order to basically manage this payroll risk. Third one is Social Security. Big topic, and Social Security is very wide, but let's focus for now on the national Social Security scheme for unemployment, for retirement, etc. So what is a key topic here? Now let me start differently. So there's always 2 risks when we look at Social Security. First, that this employee drops out of the Social Security system of the employment country. And second, the employee becomes, on a mandatory basis, part of the destination country's Social Security scheme. Both things you don't want. Like workation is meant to be temporarily. You want to remain in your home country Social Security system, and you don't want to become a part of the destination country Social Security country. That's possible, and it's even being confirmed if you have an A1 or a COC certificate. For the specialist, yes, of course, there's still some exceptions, but in general, an A1 or a COC covers you very well. It indeed says this individual remains part of the German or Dutch Social Security system, and as a result, will not become a part of the destination country Social Security. Because we're talking A1 or COC, we're actually accepting the fact or the statement that for Social Security purposes, a workation is actually qualified as a business trip. You can see it here in the bold lines. For PWD, Posted Worker Directive, we take a very different standpoint. There we say, no, a workation is not a business trip. It's not an Entsendung. It's not an assignment. It's not a posting. That might sound a little bit inconsistent. I don't think it is, to be honest, because there's absolutely no posting taking place for a workation. I think it's actually pretty weird that on a standard basis, we're qualifying workations as business trip for Social Security purposes. Although it's weird though, we're very much liking it. Because as I said, with such an A1 or a COC, you can actually be very comfortable that your employee is not being affected by these 2 risks that we discussed. So that's, I think, quite interesting. One important thing to note, if you cannot obtain an A1 or a COC certificate, there's nothing you can do in this sense. I don't think the social security risk would be very high. Probably Germany's not going to say you weren't here for 2 weeks and now I don't want you to be a part of our German social security scheme anymore. It's also pretty unlikely that all of the destination countries are going to say right away, oh, I think you should be part of our social security scheme. But it's something you simply cannot guarantee. There will always be some risk involved. We're, of course, awaiting news on a global basis around this topic, but I don't think we should be hoping too hard that that's coming anytime soon. So that's social security when we're talking at the national insurances. If we go to the next slide, we can spend some more time on, I saw a question also coming in on that topic in the chat around, oh no, that's on the next slide. If we can quickly jump to the next one, Patrick, I have to change the sequence a little bit. Thank you. Duty of care. Here we're talking more travel insurance. And what if something happens to the employee and he needs medical insurance, maybe repatriation to the home country? This is always a hot topic when we discuss workations with clients. Of course, the good news is that thankfully, it's very rare that something happens. Nevertheless, if something happens, you'd have to ask yourself the question, is this a professional accident, yes or no? If no, then of course it's still very sad for the employee, but you as an employer would not have technically anything to do with it. If yes, of course you have some kind of responsibility. You'll probably have various insurances for this. If you do not have a travel insurance, we generally recommend that you make sure that at least one travel insurance applies on a workation. It's a travel insurance that you as an employer can arrange, but you can also say, dear employee, can you please make sure that you have your own travel insurance? For the specialists, again, this is not watertight, but what we're doing with WorkFlex and by trying to manage this process is manage your risk and mitigate them, because it's simply much, much better than either doing nothing and your people will still go, or doing nothing and basically just ignoring the topic, what we still see a lot in practice. This topic, the rules and regulations have not been written for workationers, so to say, so we have to manage with what we have. This is generally a best practice, making sure travel insurance is in place, and also, of course, make sure that your employee is instructed to, for instance, not work over hours, or make sure that the working position and the workplace, even during a workation, needs to be comfortable. And also make sure that the employee has confirmed that they understand that the responsibility for all of this, of course, lies with the employee for the majority of the part during a workation, because as an employer, what can you do? So that's around duty of care. And if we jump back one slide, we come to the last part for compliance where I'd like to talk about today. It's visa immigration. Yeah, thank you. Because it's very important and interesting, by the way. Of course, also the visa and immigration rules were obviously not written for workationers. But workationers do need to have a valid working title in the destination country. I think we all agree. Of course, you can take the statement, the position that a workationer is a tourist. And yes, that is the key purpose of the trip. But it would be a little bit too easy, wouldn't it? This individual is going to work. This individual at the US Customs might indeed say, well, yes, I'm here to work. I filed a workation request and it was approved. Wrong answer, maybe, because of course this individual is there for private reasons, but you can never know what the individual is going to say. So you will definitely need to instruct them. But we take it a step further and say, okay, this individual needs a valid working title for us in order to be for the application to be approved. And how do we check this valid working title? There's only 3 options. Tourism, we already had, and then there's generally only 2 others. Local employment, which generally requires a residency, etc. It basically means that you're going to live somewhere and having a local job, which is, of course, not what a workation is. So that leaves only the last and third option, and that is business travel. And that is what we do, and we've taken that position as WorkMotion. It was confirmed by more or less all the European governments that workationers are indeed to be qualified as business travelers for visa and immigration purposes. And that's a little bit of good news and it's a little bit of bad news. The good news is, because you're not being seen as a local employee, there's quite some possibilities, especially within Europe, of course, but also if you're looking at the Western European countries, almost all of our citizens are allowed to go on a business trip to many countries around the world without an employer obligation to sponsor or to request paperwork and something like that, because they're part of the so-called visa waiver program. So that's really good news. There's also, of course, a little bit of bad news, because for some countries, you would definitely still require paperwork. That does mean that for some individuals, you'll have to say, I'm sorry, we need to obtain paperwork for you. You need a valid working title locally, and you don't have one automatically. That's a problem. So visa immigration is really a black and white story, to be honest. And that's where you come to this point that you see here on the slide also, benefit versus burden. We have taken the strategy, and I think it's like that's how we feel about workation. It is a benefit, and you should communicate it like this always. And then you can also, on a justified basis, be very honest and clear by saying, I'm sorry, dear employee, but as soon as you need a sponsorship from us to go on a vacation to Thailand or Australia or something like that, we're just going to not do it. We're going to say, well, thank you for your application. We wish you fun during your vacation, but we have to say that you cannot turn this into a workation. So that's the benefit versus burden point, which I think is pretty important. So now we've covered the 5 key compliance topics around temporary work from abroad. I don't know whether too many questions came in, Patrick, but probably you have an eye on them.
Yeah, Peter, one question that actually came in twice is if there's a time limit before the risk is high.
I'm a lawyer, so I can always answer a question with it depends. Well, yes and no. Sometimes, well, no, I have to say it. Always yes, there is a time limit, especially for PE, especially for payroll risk, but not for all of the risk. If we're looking still at the slide with visa immigration, and it's a good question. That's I hate these company-wide thresholds that say 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, because yes, for the majority of cases, you'll be able to have a nice and rather risk-free arrangement, but it also creates somewhat false expectations. For instance, for those people that do not have a valid working title, people working in Europe on the basis of a European blue card, which is issued by Germany, it's pretty unlikely that they can enjoy a workation on Mallorca. If you say we've got a company policy of 30 days, yeah, not really. It creates a false expectation because this employee will not be able to enjoy not even one day. So that's there. Sometimes time is of the essence, but sometimes it's also really black and white.
Thanks for answering, Peter. I think this makes sense. So it really depends on the case. It needs to be checked accordingly. We have another question from Melissa that was upvoted a few times. Before we talked about travel insurance. Is travel insurance for workation the same as for a business trip, or do we have more options? And in fact, I was talking to some of the leading insurance companies in Germany about this topic. And same here, it always depends. It depends on what is insured. And actually, for insurance, it depends on the fine print. So is a workation a business travel or is it not? And it could even be that the insurance companies define it differently. So end of the day, you need to make sure that the employee is insured. What we recommend as WorkMotion for employers is to tell employees they need to make sure they are insured and to take care of insurance. So then the responsibility of the employee to do this. I see that in the chat, apparently we're experiencing some sound problems. Is only Sana having this, or is this for everybody? Well, I'm not hearing anything. I assume it's only for one person. Otherwise, please let us know in the chat. Okay, good to hear. Just going through the questions to see shortly. We have another question upvoted 2 times by Margaret. She's asking, how should we deal with employees wishing to work from a campsite in terms of social insurance? We can't have A1s with changing addresses of different campsites. Peter, are you able to give an answer to this one?
Yes, I can. It's a really good question because it's an absolutely valid question, Margaret. Indeed, if you request an A1, you'll probably have to give the address where the employee is going to stay. And yeah, if he or she's a traveler, you technically have to request 25 A1s maybe, which is of course not viable. And I guess everybody also agrees that this is a weird system, right? Social Security, of course, there might be some regional Bundesland-specific arrangements, but in general, it's a country arrangement. So if you're going on a camping trip to Spain over various locations, it shouldn't be too big of a problem. And that's also our experience. What we generally do is we do request A1s. We fill out one address, and we have never run into any issues with countries authorities saying, but you're now on a different place, and then you're not covered. So it's unlikely that it leads to problems. We've also seen already in some countries or with some insurance companies in Germany that you wouldn't even have to fill out the exact location, rather just say either the city or the country, and the A1 will generally still be issued.
Yeah, that's correct. I can also share, at least in Germany, if you apply for an A1 certificate, you can either share an address or multiple addresses, but you can also state the options that you will travel a lot. So if there are many destinations, it's also fine not to give a destination. So that's at least when you apply for A1 from a German insurance company. So we talked a lot about compliance. I think one of the other benefits that one of the other topics that we hear a lot and that are very relevant is data protection. So Jonas, I know also previously before this, we talked about this a lot. What are like potential data protection risks when employees take a vacation?
Yeah, I mean, as I said in the beginning, allowing remote work or vacation, it creates a risk, in terms of data privacy. There's no way around it. So it comes all to the matrix we talked in the beginning. It comes all to how to manage those risks. And those risks, the risk is basically, to name it, it's that regulated data, meaning like personal data, meaning like data that can be linked to human being, is exposed to people who are not authorized to having access to those data. And I mean, to make it more specific, let me just give you 3 examples. One could be like working in a crowded cafe. If your employee on vacation is not working from his Airbnb, instead he's going to a cafe, maybe a very crowded place. And it sounds simple, but I mean, those are the scenarios that are most likely to occur, that someone is able to see on the screen over his shoulder, maybe even take a photograph. And if that employee is working with a highly sensitive database full of, I don't know, personal data, secret data, medical data, then you have something that GDPR calls like a data breach. And such a data breach can lead to a fine up to 20 million or 4% of yearly turnover. Another example would be like using a public Wi-Fi, which creates quite a risk. If you use like a public Wi-Fi, for example, in the same situation in that cafe, and not like your mobile Wi-Fi or not the company's Wi-Fi, you don't know who else is within that network. And if additionally the employee is using a hardware device without a firewall or without an active firewall or without an up-to-date firewall, then it's at least possible that someone else within the network is able to gain access to the laptop and therefore to the data on the laptop. And then we also would have like data breach incident. And the last or third possible scenario would be like losing devices. Losing or devices that get stolen. If you use like a laptop or USB sticks, it definitely increases the risk that those devices get stolen or lost, and therefore the data gets exposed to people who are not authorized.
Yeah, thanks, and also for sharing these concrete examples. We had it also in the chat, and also previously the discussion, like workation, is this a business travel or not? So ultimately, it's the employee's choice to work somewhere else. So when I work from Spain, it's not the company sending me there. So if we talk about data protection, is it even the responsibility of the company if there's a data breach?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point. At the end, from a GDPR perspective, the GDPR basically sees you as the employer as the controller, which basically means that you're in charge of how to handle the data, how to process the data. And basically, that means that your employee, who's just processing the data for you as the employer, you're as the employer are responsible for the actions of your employee. So if he mishandles the data, for example, in one of those three scenarios I just created, that ultimately you as the employer are basically responsible for those actions. So at the end, we have the question, what can we do to lower that risk? And that's basically, for those examples of data breaches, the important thing is that you can show as the employer that one of those scenarios, if it occurs, is just a human error, an individual case, and not a structural problem. And how do you do that? It's basically, you have to instruct your employees on how to process data, how to handle that kind of data, what to do with them, what not to do with them, so that you, at the end, are able to prove that you didn't allow, for example, to use like not encrypted USB sticks. So if the USB stick that was stolen unencrypted, and you can prove only encrypted USB sticks were allowed to use, then at least you can very likely it's that it's you're able to show that it's not a structural problem, and that will probably lower the risk of getting a fine.
Thanks, Jonas. What is this? How does this risk vary across countries? So, I mean, in Germany, across Europe, we have GDPR. Some other countries don't have this. So, is the data protection risk different across countries?
I mean, across countries within the European Union, it's basically the same. They are all within the scope of the GDPR. So every company which is seated within the GDPR, within the European Union, is within the scope of the GDPR. Even though if the employee is taking his workation outside the European Union, since you as the employer are responsible, we are within the regulation of the GDPR.
Yeah. Can you name an example where it might be a little bit tricky, one of the countries?
I mean, what do you mean with tricky? I mean, it might be different or not that easy if the company itself is not seated within the European Union, and the employee is taking his workation within the European Union, then we might come into conflict within the GDPR and other jurisdictions. That can create very complicated situations from a legal perspective.
Okay, I see. So basically, I mean, I'm looking back at the matrix that we looked at in the very beginning. So it means also when an employee goes abroad on a vacation, the employer needs to take responsibility. So we need to manage the risk somehow. So to move into the low risk or no risk quadrant, we need to have measures in place. From your experience, what are some of the exemplary measures other companies take to reduce the risk?
Yeah. it's exactly as you say. It's about managing. After we have identified the risks, and let's stick with the 3 examples I created. So now we have identified those risks, and what can we do to manage them? Yeah, and so to get to the right side of our matrix. For example, working in a crowded cafe. If you want to allow it, if you don't want to say, yeah, you can go on vacation, but only work within your Airbnb. If you want to be like a modern employer and say, yeah, choose yourself where you want to work. Let's find yourself a nice spot, and let it be even a crowded cafe. But what you have to do, I mean, use like a visual protection cover, like a privacy shield for a laptop, yeah, which makes it harder for people, at least from the side, to see what's on your laptop. It's that basic, and additionally, to bring yourself in the position to prove that you that this is what you instructed your employee, make a IT policy for your company and put those regulations in it. Yeah, have an IT policy and have your regulations. For example, if you work in crowded places in public, you're only allowed to do this with a privacy cover on your laptop surface, on your laptop screen. Done, identified, regulated, and managed. And that will bring you into the position, if even though someone used that privacy cover or didn't use it, and therefore someone else could see the screen and take a photograph, you are able to prove he signed the IT policy. I instructed him to do otherwise. It's human error. It's an individual case. It's not a structural problem. And if you're able to do this, it's very likely that authorities will not fine you. And we can stick to those examples using public Wi-Fi. Just make sure that your employees are using laptops that have a proper firewall, that have like up-to-date operating system, so they have no security gaps on their devices. Yeah, and you can do that by putting into your IT policy, basically by it's not allowed to do your own devices, only company devices, which have been checked by the IT department. Or if you want to be a bit more open and say you can bring your own devices, but only if they have been checked by our IT department, and let them check by your IT department. Are they up to date? Do they use the most recent operating system? Do they have an up-to-date firewall? Is the firewall active? So, and put that into the IT policy. And the last one about like stolen or lost devices, yeah, I think I said it earlier before already. Allow them only to use like USB sticks and copy data to them if they use like encrypted devices. So you minimize the risks, and you'll be able to prove it if you put it into your IT policy. And the last point, add to the IT policy maybe like regular trainings, because probably IT policy you hand it out within the onboarding process. But what you don't want to have to do is like someone in your company for 5 years, and now you have to prove that you instructed him on how to use his hardware devices like 5 years ago. Yeah, a court will just don't believe it. After 5 years, everybody forgets about it. So implement like regular trainings on those topics, like once a year for everybody, and just yeah, you're just being able to be sure that everybody is on board and updated on what's allowed and what's not.
Thanks, Jonas. So from what I understand, employers need to focus on data protection when employees go abroad. You mentioned a lot of measures that they can do. It's mainly related to IT measures, and also you mentioned IT policy a lot. I guess the majority of companies at least have some IT policy in place. Do they, if they already have an IT policy in place, do they still need to do something additional to that?
I mean, just having an IT policy is no guarantee for being safe or whatever. It's all about the content of the IT policy. Yeah, is the IT policy specific enough? And additionally, I mean, you should be able that everybody knows what the IT policy is about, and therefore trainings make sense. Just keeping people aware and also being able to prove that you did so.
All right, thanks. I see one question from Selina. She's asking, under what circumstances could a company get fined? Who will fine them? I'm not sure if this is related to data protection, but we mentioned fines a lot. You mentioned quite high figures. So how does this happen? Who actually fines a company then?
I mean, we have data protection authorities all over the European Union. And in most cases, for example, for WorkMotion, we are based in Berlin. So the Berlin authority would fine WorkMotion if, for example, if we would have like a data breach incident, if one WorkMotion employee would, like, I don't know, lose his laptop and the laptop is not password encrypted, and now all the personal data on the laptop is accessible to a third person. That would be enough to create something like a data breach incident. And now, if WorkMotion would not be able to prove that WorkMotion told you, Patrick, not to do this, encrypt your laptop, whatever, and you just, did not use password protection, and WorkMotion never told you, then for sure WorkMotion is responsible for this, and therefore the authorities would be able to fine WorkMotion.
Just to add on this, because it also, of course, applies on the tax and legal risks, it's important to always distinguish two things when we're talking risks, right? And that's the first thing, the actual risk, and then to like use cool words, the probability that this risk actually materializes. Indeed, that you lose a laptop, or that customs in New York start asking questions, or that someone finds you when you're walking on the beach in Spain. That probability is probably in general very, very low. The question is whether you want to do too much with that given, especially if you're a listed company, for instance. And I think in general, especially for German companies, it's like probability is a bad reason of not doing anything. I would always recommend that focus on the risk, try to manage it, and the probability might be a factor that plays in a little bit, but I think you're doing compliance mainly for yourself and not in order to basically cover your whatever you need to cover.
Great, thanks. I see one of the top most voted questions is if you have any source regarding the countries which need kind of sponsorship. And I can tell it's kind of tricky. So of course there's some countries that are always very hard to get into, but as explained during this webinar, you need to focus on a lot of factors. So the length plays a role, nationality plays a role, the work entitlement, data protection, etc. So it's not that easy. And taking this to the next level and trying to summarize it a little bit. In the beginning, we showed this quadrant. So as an employer, you need to make a choice. Where do you want to position yourself? It was great to see that a lot of companies are already in quadrant B, but we also see a lot of A and C. So what are potential solutions for your company to get into B if you're not already there? So if you're in A, C, or D, and you want to get into B because you want to allow Workations as a benefit and you want to manage the risks, there are basically three solutions what you can do. The first one is all this know-how, compliance, and data protection that we talked about today. You try to get the know-how internally while being very complex with over 200 destination countries and tax laws, etc. So one option to get the know-how internally, and also to manage the workflows. What we also see in the market a lot is consultants, tax advisors, etc. doing consulting, which also makes sense, but it's a very costly but also time-intensive process. And then the third option that you have is to use software. And here, if I may, I would shortly like to introduce WorkFlex. So at WorkMotion, we have developed an easy-to-use software, which we offer to companies to manage Workations. And ultimately, the software can be used by the employees, the managers, and the admins. So, of course, the employees is the ultimate beneficiary of this software because they want to work from abroad. So we handle it through the software. We can manage all the risks that we have mentioned here today. We can manage through the software. Also, on top of the risks that we mentioned here, companies have additional workflows and processes that need to be taken care of. And you see here I mentioned the manager. So for example, what happens in companies, similar to a vacation request, the manager needs to approve. Maybe we need to talk about, does the employee need to be in the office? Are there time zone differences, etc.? So there needs to be a discussion. So one of the ways to solve this and to offer Workations is with WorkFlex, which is a fully compliant solution. And we manage the risks, but also manage the entire workflows. So I don't want to advertise now too much, but if you are interested about this and want to have additional information, what you can do, you can schedule a free consultation with one of our experts, schedule like 30 minutes, and we can give you more insights about the compliance risks, but also show you as the software. So if this is interesting for you, please feel free to go to our website and book a session. I'm linking it right now in the chat. So we're approaching the end here. I can still see there's some questions that are open. For example, Katerina, the top-rated question, is asking for the sources. What we will do now is we're going to follow up with every individual open question personally by email to make sure that this is answered. And looking at the time, we want to finish on time. I will close it right here. So thank you very much for coming to this webinar. I hope the goal of this session for you to understand the compliance risk, but also data protection risk was achieved. You know a little bit more now than before. So this was successful. And a big shout out and big thanks to the two speakers here today. Pieter for giving us insights about tax, and also a big shout out to Jonas. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us insights about data protection.